Hello everybody, in the video today we are exploring another pawn structure. This time we are looking at the doubled pawn structure, which as the name suggests occurs when one side has two pawns stacked in front of each other on the same file. So as always, we're going to look at some game examples, we're going to talk about the themes and ideas for both sides, and by the end of the video you're going to be able to navigate these positions with complete confidence. So let's jump right in. I do have one little thing I want to emphasize right before. This is part of a larger masterclass that I'm making of the 7 most crucial pawn structures in chess. This is chapter 4. We've already discussed the hanging, the isolated, and the backwards pawns, and we have a couple more to look at after this one. So if you're interested, links are in the description. But now let's focus on what we're looking at today, the doubled pawns. So the doubled pawn structure, to be completely honest, is just a weakness. And I think this is very apparent just by looking at an example like this. The pawns don't defend each other. When you look at a pawn structure like this, the pawns not only have the ability to defend each other were they to kind of push and create a pawn formation, but further, the pawns also block the squares in front of them, and therefore they take many more squares away from the opponent's king and their pieces. Here, the king has far easier access towards these pawns, and similarly a knight, for example, can jump in to the square on f4, it can come to h3, a queen could land here, which it otherwise would not be able to with the pawn on g2. And so these pawn structures are not only a weakness of themselves, but also the squares in their vicinity become far less protected. And so generally speaking, you want to avoid these structures. Now, that's not always possible. Sometimes out of necessity, you have to create a situation where you're left with doubled pawns, because otherwise you'd be losing material or, getting mated or something of the sort. But generally speaking, avoiding these positions is in your best interest. Now, as with all rules in chess, there are exceptions to this idea. Sometimes you voluntarily enter a doubled pawn position because you have some form of compensation. So I want to show 2 examples of this in openings that I'm very familiar with. So first of all, the Caro-Kann, which I love from the black side, we often enter the Tartakower variation where we give ourselves these doubled pawns, but in exchange we have a couple of things going for us. First of all, we open up our other bishop, and so this bishop has much quicker development. Secondly, one thing to notice, these pawns, although they are doubled by definition, they're part of a larger pawn mass on the king side. And so even though the pawns might seem weak, they're actually not as weak as they might appear. And the reason for this is because all of these squares in front of the pawns are very nicely guarded, largely because of the pawn on the g-file. If this pawn was, say, on b6 or, I don't know, h6 or something, this would be a terrible position and not an opening theoretical line. However, with the pawns the way they are, this pawn mass, if anything, can be used as a strength later to push forward and grab space. And so often if the pawns A, open up your pieces, give your pieces squares that would be very valuable for them, but also B, if they could be used later in combination with other pawns to kind of march forward, that is one exception. And a secondary exception, which I want to show you, and this is maybe more of a classical example of the doubled pawns, because in this case, there's no way to avoid it. These are doubled pawns and there's no G pawn, and so these are weak. But in this case, the compensation for black comes in the form of these 2 bishops. They have the pair of bishops in a position that is not completely closed. It's kind of semi-closed, semi-open. There's possibilities to further open it up. And so the bishops give black in this endgame or middle game position great compensation for the doubled pawns. And if white were to try to target this bishop, they would have to do so by getting rid of the weakness of the doubled pawns. And so that is, 2 of the ways in which doubled pawns can be used by choice in the game. However, if you are kind of forced into a position with doubled pawns, you don't have great compensation or anything specific for them, they're usually not something that you want to allow. So now let's take a look at some game examples which show just how weak doubled pawns can actually be. So we have 2 examples. The first one is a position which quickly became an endgame. So the queens were traded, and what you'll see is that in just a couple of moments, more pieces get traded. The bishops, and then the rooks, the knights get traded, then the rooks get traded. And even the bishop for the knight here, eventually, in just a couple more moves, the final pair of minor pieces and rooks get off the board. We're left with a completely simplified position. Both players have 6 pawns. They have a king, equal material, no other pieces. It must be a draw, right? Well, what you'll notice, of course, the doubled pawns here. And one of the trades, generally speaking, all of the trades in this game were fine because they didn't change the structure except for the trade on f3. When black was able to take the knight with their bishop on f3, white was forced to take back with the pawn and give themselves the doubled pawns. Now, this might not seem like a massive issue because black doesn't seem like it has the pieces necessary to take advantage of this weakness, but they do. They have the king. And as I mentioned, the weakness of the doubled pawns, it's not only the pawns themselves, but the squares around it. So this h3 square, like I pointed out early, is a square that black is just going for. And the threat for black of getting to h3, where it will hit h2, it will threaten to come to g2, where it hits f2 and f3, and then, wipe out all of these pawns and then just create a passer. This threat is so serious that white was forced into complete passivity. Look what they had to do. They had to go king d2, king e2, or d1, e1, doesn't really matter, but then f1 and g1. They had to slide all the way to the right and just defend. And that is one of the main benefits of the doubled pawns. Even though you might not always be able to put immediate pressure on these pawns and win them, you can, generally speaking, use the threat of the weaknesses that the doubled pawns opened up, the squares around them, to force your opponent into taking a very passive formation. And so here, the king would have wanted to, go up and start making threats of its own right, but it was forced into this very passive state because of the fact that their structure on the king side for white is just so weak. And so from this position, this king can't do anything. It just shuffles, as you'll see, h1, g1. And so what does black do? They push their pawns, they freeze their opponent's pawns, and eventually they break through. So let's take a look. So the pawns just push forward, and eventually, when the time becomes right, they push g3 at the moment where after takes, by the way, white resigned here because, of course, after takes, black gets opposition. They're going to pick up this pawn, then they're going to promote, or take these pawns and promote. The game is over. And guys, this is one of the most simple games to analyze or to kind of interpret because nothing happened aside from a massive trade of queens, of bishops, of rooks, of knights, of every single piece into a complete endgame. And this endgame can be explained with one concept: doubled pawns. These pawns are so weak that black just got a massive initiative and could put huge pressure in the endgame, and that was the only thing they needed to win. I mean, this is such a simple game that black won. I mean, it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to learn or nice ideas here, but kind of the strategical ideas that black used were nothing more than trading into a position that's advantageous because one of the trades included a doubled pawn formation for the white side. Very nice example. And you can see how doubled pawns on their own can be such a massive weakness that's all you need sometimes to win games. Let's look at a second example, which is a little bit more complicated. It's the Nimzo-Indian, and you can see here that the Nimzo is often defined by these doubled pawns on the c-file. One thing I should point out, from black's point of view, you never trade here c for d because they're going to take back, get rid of their doubled pawns, and now white has extra space and black doesn't have the doubled pawns to compensate for that. So what black goes for is they go instead for a setup with the d6, where if white ever takes, these doubled pawns remain no matter what. And very often, the setups that we reach in these positions are closed positions where these two pawns are the weaknesses that black tries to attack. And what they usually do is they put their knight on a5, they put their pawn on b6, they put their bishop on a6, and they just put pressure on this c4 pawn that is doubled and therefore cannot be defended on either side. And this is a very effective plan. I made a Nimzo masterclass, and this was one of the major plans that we discussed and we often went for because it's simply so effective. White is going to be forced into a very passive state once again in order to defend from these passed pawns. sorry, doubled pawns. And so that is one of the major ideas. Now, admittedly here, Black went for a different idea. They didn't put their knight on a5. They didn't put their bishop on a6. They just developed in a different way, which is also fine. I mean, these pawns pose other issues and other problems for the white side. So what are some of those problems? Well, one is this a pawn is also weak. And this is something that you'll see white ends up really regretting, the fact that this pawn becomes very a massive target for the black side. Now, one other thing I want to point out, these pawns are also doubled, but they're far safer than these pawns because, first of all, as I mentioned kind of earlier, there is a pawn mass attached to them. But further, after black castles, the open f-file will be very useful. And so the doubled pawns here were kind of taken on with the black side in order to open up the rook. So bishop e3, b6, castles, castles, a4, a5, and here rook b1, bishop d7, putting pressure on this a4 pawn. Again, it's weak largely because of the doubled pawns formation. So rook b2, the rook slides over to f2. One thing I do want to mention, sometimes doubled pawns do offer benefits. Like I said, this rook is open, and similarly the b file is open, so pressure on b6 is possible. But here, because the b6 pawn is so close to black's territory, they're going to have no issues defending it. I mean, the queen and the rook can defend, the knight can defend, the rook on f6 can defend. So the weakness here for black is just, you know, far smaller than the weaknesses that these doubled pawns create. So rook to b2, rook to b8, the rook slides over, bishop c2, trying to defend. It makes sense, but unfortunately what you're going to end up seeing, this queen and bishop just tie down this queen and bishop again. That is a key idea. We saw this in the previous game. The king on g1 was tied down to passivity, defending the pawn structure in the endgame. Same thing here. These pieces are tied down to defending a4. Now, queen g6, the queen comes to d3. We have a couple of trade of the rooks. And again, in this, you know, more endgame position now, there is again pressure on white constantly because of the ruined structure here. Now, admittedly, black made breakthroughs on this side of the board, which aided, right? There's the idea of the two weaknesses where you want to attack on both sides of the board. So it helps to kind of come at these positions from multiple angles, but there's no overstating the fact that the doubled pawns here were a massive weakness. And this position here proves that immensely because of bishop takes a4. A direct move that can only be played because the pawn structure is so ruined. The pawn on a4 is weak. If queen takes bishop, queen takes d4, hits the bishop with mate, hits g2 with mate, black crashes through with fatal effect. And so after bishop a4, white resigned. Obviously, I mean, you could move the queen somewhere and defend, but now we're totally crashing through. Here, for example, you could take, and then once again, take the pawn on e4 and continue to crash through. Again, the c4 pawn in this line does become a weakness once black manages to open up the position and get their queen involved. You can see the doubled pawns themselves do actually become targets as well. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is more or less the things to understand about doubled pawns. It's not only the weakness of the pawns themselves, but also the squares and the other pieces and pawns around them, which do suffer when you get doubled pawns. That is not to say that there are moments where doubled pawns are not useful, for example here, or in the other opening lines that I showed earlier in the video, but generally speaking, doubled pawns is a structure that you want to avoid at all costs. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully it kind of helped you navigate these positions more successfully. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it. Again, links to this masterclass and all of the related files are below in the description, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.